They say the swamp still whispers his name when the wind dies down and the moon hangs low over the Carolina lowlands. Jonas Hol was a man of profound stillness, a shadow that moved through the plantation without ever disturbing the dust. To the masters, he was a mute laborer, a piece of living machinery that never complained and never resisted. But behind that mask of compliance was a mind that worked like a watchmaker's, cataloguing every weakness in the system that held him. He didn't just work the fields, he studied the geometry of the fences, the shifting patterns of the guards, and the secret language of the marshes that bordered the Hol estate. For 10 years, he lived in a state of absolute observation, waiting for the precise moment when the laws of men would falter against the laws of nature. He was a master of the invisible, a man who had realized that true power didn't lie in the strength of one's fists, but in the depth of one's patience. The morning of his disappearance began with a fog so thick it felt like a physical weight against the skin. Clark, the lead overseer, was a man governed by the brass bell in his hand and the cold ink in his ledger. He stepped into the yard, expecting the usual shuffling of weary feet and the low murmurs of a waking camp. Instead, he found a silence so heavy it made his ears ring. When he reached the far shed where Jonas was kept, the door was standing wide, not smashed open by force, but unlocked with an eerie surgical precision. On the dirt floor lay the shackles. They hadn't been filed or broken. They were simply open, arranged in a perfect line as if they had been laid out for an inspection. The iron was cold and dry, showing no signs of the struggle Clark expected. It was as if Jonas had ceased to be a prisoner not by breaking his chains, but by convincing the iron itself that it no longer had a reason to hold him. Silas Hol, a man whose authority was carved out of granite and grit, stood over those open shackles with a growing sense of unease. He had owned Jonas for a decade, yet as he looked at the neatly arranged restraints, he realized he had never known the man at all. Silas was a man who calculated everything, profits, losses, and the exact amount of pressure needed to keep a soul in check. But Jonas had become a variable he couldn't solve. "He's been watching us," Silas whispered, his voice barely audible over the morning mist. 10 years of silence wasn't submission, it was a study. He kicked at the shackles, but the hollow clank they made against the earth offered no satisfaction. He immediately ordered the mobilization of his best trackers, but deep down, a primal instinct told him that they weren't chasing a common runaway. They were pursuing a man who had already spent a lifetime mastering the very ground they were about to walk upon. The first pursuit was led by Reese, a man whose confidence was built on the baying of bloodhounds and the weight of a loaded rifle. He brought 8 men with him, veterans of a dozen hunts who viewed a runaway as nothing more than a sport to be concluded before sundown. They found the trail within an hour, leading directly into the black water heart of the swamp. It was a sloppy trail, broken reeds, muddy footprints, and scraps of fabric caught on low-hanging branches. Reese laughed, mocking the supposed brilliance of the escapee. "He's panicked," Reese told his men, his voice echoing with an arrogance that the swamp seemed to swallow whole. "He's moving fast and making mistakes. We'll have him in irons before the owls start calling." But Clark, who followed at the rear, noticed something that chilled him. The stride of the footprints never changed. Whether the ground was firm or mired in muck, the distance between each step was identical. Jonas wasn't running, he was pacing himself. As the sun began to dip behind the canopy, turning the swamp into a cathedral of long shadows and orange light, the trackers made camp in a small clearing. They felt secure in their numbers and their weapons, but the marsh had a way of shrinking a man's world as darkness fell. The sounds of the night, the croaking of bullfrogs and the rhythmic clicking of insects, seemed to grow louder, more intentional. When the first light of dawn filtered through the moss, the hunters woke to a nightmare of silence. Their lead dog was shivering, refusing to pick up a scent, and 2 of their men were simply gone. In the center of the camp, on a fallen cypress log, sat the missing men's gear. Their rifles, powder horns, and boots were arranged in a neat row, perfectly dry despite the damp air. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, and no tracks leading away. It was a psychological strike, a message delivered in the language of order. Jonas could reach into their world whenever he chose. Panic began to fray the edges of the group's resolve. The younger trackers whispered about ghosts and swamp spirits, their eyes darting toward every rustle in the undergrowth. Reese tried to maintain control, shouting orders and cursing the missing men as cowards, but his voice lacked its previous edge. He realized that they were no longer the hunters. They were the pieces in a game whose rules they didn't understand. The sloppy trail they had followed wasn't a series of mistakes. It was a lure, a carefully constructed path designed to bring them exactly where Jonas wanted them. They were deep in the labyrinth now, miles from the plantation, surrounded by a landscape that Jonas had memorized while they were still sleeping in their beds. Every tree, every sinkhole, and every shadowed pool was now a potential weapon in the hands of a man who had turned 10 years of oppression into a masterclass in environmental warfare. By the end of the first part of their journey, the trackers had realized the terrifying truth of their situation. Jonas Hol hadn't just escaped a plantation, he had rewritten the power dynamic of the entire region. He was out there in the darkness, invisible and patient, watching the firelight flicker in their frightened eyes. He didn't need to fire a shot or raise a blade to defeat them. He only needed to let the swamp and their own rising terror do the work for him. As Clark stared into the trees, he felt a gaze fixed upon him, a calm, observant gaze that saw right through his rifle and his authority. Jonas wasn't a ghost, but he was something far more dangerous, a man who had finally decided that he was the one in control. The hunt had only just begun, but the hunters were already lost in a world that now answered only to the man they had once called a slave. The news of the vanishing trackers rippled through the whole plantation like a fever, shifting the air from one of routine labor to one of cold electric tension. It wasn't merely the loss of men that unsettled the overseers, it was the shattering of the illusion of absolute control. If one man could reach out from the dark and pluck armed veterans from their camp without a single cry for help, then the iron bars and heavy gates of the estate were no longer a fortress. They were a cage with a broken lock. Silas Hol watched his workers from the high porch, his eyes narrow and calculating. He saw the way their heads didn't bow as low as they once did, and how their silences were no longer filled with fatigue, but with a burgeoning, dangerous hope. He knew that if Jonas Hol was not brought back in chains, and soon, the very foundation of his world would dissolve into the muck of the Carolina marshes. Driven by a mixture of wounded pride and genuine terror, Silas emptied his coffers to summon a force that the lowlands had never seen. Within 48 hours, the plantation yard was no longer a place of harvest, but a staging ground for a private army. Nearly 100 men arrived, a motley collection of professional bounty hunters, scarred mercenaries, and former border soldiers who viewed the hunt as a lucrative sport. The air was thick with the smell of gun oil, tobacco, and the restless energy of men who believed that numbers and lead could conquer any mystery. They bragged of past captures and laughed at the stories of the ghost in the swamp, dismissing the first trackers' failures as the work of amateurs. Silas stood before them, his face a mask of iron, offering a bounty that would make a man wealthy for a decade. "Bring him back," Silas commanded, his voice a low growl. "Alive if possible, dead if necessary, but bring him back so this plantation remembers who owns the land." High above the swamp floor, cradled in a throne of Spanish moss and ancient oak, Jonas watched the dust cloud raised by the arriving militia. He did not feel the panic of the prey. He felt the cold, analytical detachment of a master strategist. He looked at the 100 men and saw not a force of strength but a system of noise and consumption. 100 men required 100 rations. They created 100 trails and made enough noise to wake the stones. To Jonas they were a clumsy giant, loud and blind, stumbling into a cathedral where he was the only one who knew the prayers. He began to calculate the timing of their movements, the weight of their gear, and the psychological breaking point of men who were used to fighting enemies they could see. He wasn't just planning an escape anymore, he was preparing a masterclass in environmental attrition. Deep within a region of the marsh known as the Devil's Throat, a place so treacherous and labyrinthine that even the bravest hunters avoided it, lay the true fruit of Jonas's long silence. It was a Maroon settlement, a hidden sanctuary built into the very ribs of the earth. Here, under a canopy so dense that sunlight arrived only in scattered coins of gold, lived 20 souls who had slipped through the cracks of the world. Maroa, the elder whose memories stretch back to the old countries across the sea, presided over a community that existed on the edge of the impossible. Shelters were constructed from living vines and peat, designed to look like natural hummocks from the air. Small gardens grew in the rich, dark soil, and water was gathered from secret springs. For 6 months, Jonas had been their architect, using his position on the plantation to funnel supplies, tools, and information to this shadow world, building a fortress of the spirit. Jonas descended from the heights and entered the settlement, his presence bringing a quiet intensity to the camp. He stood before the Maroons, not as a leader who demanded obedience, but as a teacher who offered survival. "The army is at the gate," he told them, his voice steady as a heartbeat. "They bring fire and dogs, but they bring their own fear too. We will not meet them with steel. We will meet them with the swamp." Over the next few days, he transformed the community into a unit of ghosts. He taught the young men how to walk backward in their own tracks to create false trails, and how to move through waist-deep water without creating a single ripple. He showed them how to use the mud as a second skin, disappearing into the trunk of a cypress tree while a soldier stood only feet away. He was giving them the greatest weapon of the oppressed, the ability to become part of the landscape that the oppressors feared. As the militia finally surged into the tree line, led by a veteran colonel who believed in the efficacy of scorched earth, Jonas began his psychological gambit. He didn't fire a single shot. Instead, he left graveyards of intent along their path. A soldier would wander 10 yards from the line to relieve himself and find his hat hanging from a branch 20 feet in the air, or find his rifle replaced by a carved wooden replica while he slept. The forest began to speak to the hunters in a language of vanished things. Jonas used the natural acoustics of the swamp to throw voices, making it seem as if the missing men were calling from the depths of the black water. The militia's arrogance began to curdle into a primal, superstitious dread. They were realizing that they weren't fighting a runaway. They were fighting a man who had successfully recruited the very earth they walked upon to act as his accomplice. By the end of the first week of the Great Hunt, the militia's systematic sweep had devolved into a desperate scramble for survival. The heat was a physical enemy, the insects were a constant torment, and the sense of being watched was a weight that never lifted. Silas Hol's army of 100 had been reduced to a shivering mass of men who refused to sleep and jumped at the snap of a twig. They had found no settlement, no Jonas, and no glory. Only the mounting evidence that they were being outthought at every turn. Deep in the heart of the marsh, Jonas sat with Maroa, listening to the distant, frantic horns of the militia. "They are ready," he whispered. "They have reached the point where they will believe in ghosts before they believe in their own eyes. Now we show them exactly what the swamp can do." The militia's failure to secure a single prisoner began to rot the colonel's discipline, turning organized military strategy into a desperate, scorched earth vendetta. Frustration is a toxic fuel, and after days of chasing echoes and finding empty boots, the hunters decided that if they could not conquer the swamp, they would simply erase it. The order went out for the Great Burn, a systematic application of fire designed to strip Jonas of his cover and smoke the Maroons out like vermin from a hole. Throughout the perimeter, soldiers began to stack dry brush and douse the undergrowth in oil, creating a ring of potential devastation. The scent of the marsh changed from the sweet, heavy rot of vegetation to the sharp, acrid bite of impending flame. Jonas watched the first plumes of smoke rise from the horizon, realizing that the game had shifted from psychological maneuvering to a brutal race against an elemental force. The militia was no longer searching for a man. They were attempting to murder a landscape. Inside the hidden settlement, the arrival of the smoke acted as a countdown for the soul. Among the Maroons, fear was a constant companion, but for most, it was tempered by the hard-won wisdom of survival. However, there was one among them, a young man named Ezekiel, whose spirit had been pulverized by the plantation long before he ever reached the devil's throat. Ezekiel had arrived only weeks earlier, his back still a map of fresh scars, and his eyes perpetually wide with the frantic energy of a trapped bird. To him, the encroaching smoke wasn't a tactical challenge. It was the breath of a vengeful god coming to reclaim him. He watched Jonas with a mixture of awe and resentment, unable to believe that a man could stand so still while the world was beginning to burn. Ezekiel's terror was a quiet, corrosive thing, whispering that surrender might be the only way to stop the fire, that perhaps a return to the lash was better than a slow death in a furnace. The night before the fires were fully lit, the camp was a graveyard of unspoken anxieties. Jonas moved among the families, his hands steady as he checked supply packs and reinforced the camouflaged roofs, but he could feel the fracture lines forming in the community's resolve. In the shadows of a weeping willow, Ezekiel sat apart, his fingers digging into the soft peat until his nails bled. He was convinced that Jonas was a fanatic leading them into a trap, and that the militia's promises of mercy for informants were his only hope for salvation. When the camp finally fell into a fitful, smoke-filled sleep, Ezekiel slipped away. He didn't have Jonas's skill for silence, but the rising wind and the crackling of the distant brush fires masked his clumsy retreat. He moved toward the eastern perimeter, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, driven by the catastrophic delusion that he could bargain with a monster to save his own skin. Jonas discovered the void in the camp before the sun had even cleared the canopy. He didn't need to ask who was gone. The empty bedding and the abandoned personal trinkets told the story of a man who had traded his brothers for a hollow promise of safety. Jonas summoned Darius, and together they tracked Ezekiel's path through the morning mist. The trail was a map of panic, snapped branches, deep sliding footprints in the mud, and the discarded remnants of a rations bag. They reached the edge of the swamp's buffer zone just in time to see the evidence of the crime. In a small clearing, the ground was trampled by heavy military boots, and scattered among the leaves were metallic ration wrappers and the remains of a cold fire. Ezekiel had met with the scouts, and the information he possessed, the location of the Devil's Throat and the secret of the water channels, was now a weapon in the colonel's hands. The consequence of the betrayal was immediate and deafening. A horn blast echoed from the eastern ridge, a signal of coordination that sent a chill through Jonas's bones. They weren't just burning the brush anymore. The militia had begun a controlled, horseshoe-shaped burn, intentionally designed to herd the Maroons toward a narrow bottleneck where the main force waited with bayonets and chains. The fire moved with a terrifying, sentient hunger, leaping from the dry palmettos to the mossy limbs of the oaks. Animals fled past Jonas in a frantic stampede, deer, panthers, and snakes, all driven by the same primal instinct to escape the heat. The air became a shimmering haze of embers and ash, making every breath a struggle against suffocation. Jonas realized that the refuge he had built with such meticulous care was no longer a sanctuary. It had become a target, and the time for hiding had officially ended. Returning to the camp, Jonas found the Maroons gathered in the center of the settlement, their faces illuminated by the orange glow of the approaching inferno. Panic threatened to dissolve the group into a disorganized mob, but Maroa stood her ground, her voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. Jonas didn't waste time with explanations of Ezekiel's treason. The fire was all the explanation they needed. "We leave now," he commanded, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. "We take nothing but the children and the water skins. The militia thinks they have us pinned against the deep water, but they've forgotten that we know what lies beneath it." He began to direct the evacuation toward the secret underwater channel he had constructed months ago, a passage woven from living reeds that led to a deeper, hidden tributary. It was a desperate gambit, requiring them to trust the water as much as they feared the fire. As the first tongues of flame licked at the outskirts of the settlement, Jonas stood at the rear of the line, watching his people disappear one by one into the dark, tannic water. He saw the terror in the children's eyes as they took their final breaths before submerging, and he felt the crushing weight of every life that now hung on the strength of his planning. Behind them, the sounds of the militia were growing louder, the rhythmic thud of marching boots and the shouts of officers who believed they finally had the ghost in a corner. The sky was a bruised purple, choked with the soot of a destroyed world. Jonas took a final look at the cabins and gardens, the physical evidence of a dream that was being reduced to ash, and then he followed his people into the depths. He was the last to leave the burning world, entering the silence of the water with a vow that the fire would not be the end of their story. The transition from the suffocating heat of the burning swamp to the predatory chill of the Appalachian foothills was a shock that threatened to shatter the group's remaining strength. As they emerged from the hidden water channels, the Maroons were a collection of shivering ghosts, their skin gray with ash and their clothing clinging to them like heavy, sodden skin. The world behind them was a wall of orange light and falling timber, but the world ahead was a jagged silhouette of ancient stone and deep, unfamiliar timber. Jonas stood at the edge of the rising terrain, his lungs burning with the residue of smoke, and watched his people collapse onto the damp earth. They had lost their sanctuary, their gardens, and the small comforts of a home they had built with their own hands. In that moment of absolute exhaustion, the temptation to simply stop, to let the cold or the militia take them, was a physical pull. Jonas realized that his greatest challenge was no longer the fire, it was the psychological inertia of despair that threatened to anchor them to the mud. The silence of the forest was soon broken by a sound that made every heart in the clearing stutter, the rhythmic, brassy call of militia horns echoing from the lowlands. The hunters had not been discouraged by the fire, they had been emboldened by it. The colonel, realizing his prey had slipped through the bottleneck, had expanded his search into a massive, northern sweeping grid. Jonas listened to the intervals between the horn blasts, his mind automatically mapping the distance and the speed of their advance. They were nearly 2 miles away, but they were moving with military precision, pushing through the undergrowth in coordinated waves. Jonas knew that if they followed the obvious paths through the valleys, they would be run down by dawn. He turned to the group, his eyes meeting theirs with a fierce, uncompromising clarity. "The swamp was a room," he told them, his voice rasping from the smoke. "But the mountains are a fortress. We stop being prey tonight and we start being the wind." To break the scent trail for the militia's hounds, Jonas led the group toward a swift, ice-cold mountain stream that cut a jagged path through the granite. He commanded everyone, from the eldest grandmother to the smallest child, to enter the rushing water. They didn't just cross it. Jonas had them wade upstream for 20 yards, then double back and walk nearly a quarter-mile downstream within the current itself. The water was a freezing, numbing force that stole the breath from their lungs and turned their feet into leaden weights. Children cried silently, their teeth chattering with such violence that the sound seemed to echo off the rocks. Jonas moved among them, physically hauling the exhausted through the current, his own muscles screaming against the cold. By the time they emerged onto a rocky outcropping, they were nearly hypothermic, but the trail was gone. The bloodhounds would reach the water's edge and find only a void, leaving the militia to guess which way the shadows had fled. Knowing the militia would eventually regain their bearings, Jonas pushed the group into a formidable barrier of mountain briars, a dense, thorny thicket that guarded the eastern ridge like a wall of living wire. While the hunters would seek the easiest path, Jonas chose the most painful one, realizing that a trail of blood was less dangerous than a trail of footprints. The thorns tore at their skin and shredded what remained of their clothing, but the briars also acted as a natural shield, hiding their heat and their movement from the valley below. Lena, her arm still raw from the swamp fire, pushed through without a single complaint, using her own body to create a passage for the younger children. This was the tax of freedom, 1,000 small cuts and the constant presence of pain. Jonas watched his people endure, realizing that the brutality of their journey was forging them into something the plantation could never reclaim. A people who had learned that pain was a temporary price for an eternal soul. The arrival of a steady, grey rain in the mid-morning was a gift from a god they had feared was indifferent. The downpour washed away the scent of ash, muffled the sound of their movement, and turned the forest floor into a veil of mist. In the middle of this soaking trek, Jonas found a young girl named Sarah huddled beneath a dripping oak, her small body shaking with a terror that no words could soothe. He knelt in the mud beside her and told her the story of the mountain eagle, the bird that doesn't hide from the storm, but uses the rising winds to soar above the clouds, where the sun never stops shining. "You are that eagle, Sarah," he whispered, his voice steady against the rain. "The rain is just the wind helping you climb. Don't look at the mud at your feet. Look at the heights where the soldiers can't reach." The girl's crying subsided into a determined sniffle, and she stood, grabbing her mother's hand with a strength that moved Jonas more than any act of war. To further deceive the militia, Jonas utilized a psychological redirection involving small reflective mica stones he found embedded in a limestone outcropping. Using mud and careful positioning, he created dozens of false glints along a southern leading ridge, markers that would catch the sunlight once the rain cleared. To a distant observer with a spyglass, these glints would look like the reflection of metal or the flickering of a small hidden campfire. He wanted the colonel to believe they were doubling back toward the lowlands, drawing the bulk of the military force away from their true northern heading. It was a game of mirrors and shadows, playing on the hunter's own expectations of how a panicked fugitive should behave. Jonas understood that the best way to hide was to give the hunters exactly what they were looking for, just in a place where he wasn't. As the second night fell, Jonas guided the exhausted Maroons to a shallow cave carved into a limestone hillside, its entrance hidden behind a curtain of ancient oak roots and hanging vines. The interior was dry and smelled of cold stone, a stark contrast to the humid, rotting scent of the swamp. As the group filed into the shadows, collapsing onto the hard ground in a state of absolute physical defeat, Jonas stood at the entrance and looked back down into the valley. Far below, he could see the flickering torches of the militia, tiny orange sparks moving in a frustrated, disorganized pattern far to the south of their true location. They were safe, if only for a night. He looked at Lena, at Maroa, and at the sleeping children, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't just survival. "We are safer than we have ever been," he whispered to the stone, "because they are looking for slaves, and all that is left in this cave are people." 3 months in the Appalachian foothills had transformed the Maroons from a group of fleeing survivors into a deliberate, thriving society. The transition was marked not by a single event, but by the quiet, daily victories of construction and cultivation. Tucked into a narrow valley where 3 crystal streams converged, they had built a settlement that was nearly indistinguishable from the mountain itself. Jonas stood on a high ridge, looking down at the terrace gardens that climbed the southern slope like a staircase of green life. These weren't the forced monocultures of the plantation. They were a complex tapestry of squash, beans, and corn, irrigated by a system of stone channels that Jonas had designed to mimic the natural flow of the mountain springs. Every level of the garden fed the one below it, a cycle of replenishment that symbolized their new reality. They were no longer stealing hours from a master. They were investing their labor into a future that they owned. The air here was thin and sweet, free of the acrid smoke of the lowlands, and for the first time in his life, Jonas looked at the horizon and didn't see a boundary, but a beginning. The architecture of the new settlement was a masterclass in camouflage and permanence. Unlike the fragile vine shelters of the swamp, these cabins were built from the very bones of the mountain. Using stacked limestone and heavy timber, the Maroons created dwellings with low profiles and sod-covered roofs that blended seamlessly into the forest floor. From the ridges above, a searcher would see only the natural undulations of the valley and the thick canopy of oak and pine. The smoke from the cooking fires was funneled through underground cooling pits that dispersed the heat and filtered the visible plumes, ensuring that their presence remained a secret kept by the trees. Inside these homes, the dirt floors were packed hard and covered with woven mats, and the sound of children's laughter was no longer a danger to be muffled, but a rhythm to be celebrated. They had realized that true invisibility wasn't just about hiding. It was about existing so harmoniously with the environment that the world forgot you were ever supposed to be a stranger to it. Darius, who had once been a young man defined by the speed of his flight, had become the settlement's primary sentinel. He managed a network of 4 lookout points that covered every approach to the valley, each positioned to provide a 2-mile sightline of the lower trails. He and Jonas had developed a communication system using the reflective properties of local minerals and the specific calls of mountain birds, allowing the community to shift into a state of total concealment long before a patrol could ever reach the perimeter. But the militia rarely came this high. The terrain was too punishing for men who required supply wagons and clear roads. The mountains had become a natural filter, stripping away the weak-willed and the unobservant. Darius moved with a new kind of confidence, his body lean and hard from the constant climbing. He no longer looked back over his shoulder for a master. He looked forward for his people, realizing that his role was no longer to escape the past, but to protect the sanctuary they had carved out of the wilderness. In the center of the settlement, under the sprawling limbs of an ancient white oak, the community's spirit was anchored by the voices of the women. Maroa had become the keeper of their oral history, spending her afternoons telling the children stories of ancestors who had crossed oceans and survived fires. These stories were the invisible threads that bound the group together, transforming their individual traumas into a collective legacy of strength. Nearby, Lena had established a school that Jonas considered the settlement's most vital fortification. Using charcoal and sheets of birch bark, she taught the children, and many of the adults, the power of the written word. Jonas often watched from the shadows as a young boy named Moses traced the shape of his own name. He understood that literacy was the ultimate escape. If a man could read, he could no longer be lied to about his place in the world. He could verify the truth for himself and carry the thoughts of thousands of others in his mind. The school wasn't just teaching letters, it was weaponizing the intellect against the myth of inferiority. The settlement began to grow as word of its existence trickled down through the invisible channels of the enslaved South. Every few weeks, a scout would lead a bedraggled family or a solitary, exhausted runner into the valley. These newcomers arrived with the same haunted look Jonas had once worn, their eyes searching for the trap they assumed must be waiting for them. One man, arriving with 2 children and a heart full of grief, had stopped in the center of the gardens and asked, "Is this real, or am I dead in a ditch somewhere?" Jonas had handed him a cup of cold spring water and a handful of fresh beans, letting the physical reality of the food and the quiet safety of the valley provide the answer. They never turned anyone away, but they required every soul to contribute to the collective survival. They were building an underground that didn't just move people toward the north, but settled them into a life of dignity and self-reliance right under the noses of those who sought to hunt them. The internal politics of the group had evolved from the frantic democracy of the trail to a stable, consensus-based community. Conflicts over resources or labor were resolved in the evening circles, where every voice, regardless of age or gender, was given the space to be heard. Jonas remained a figure of quiet authority, but he worked hard to ensure that the settlement didn't depend solely on his vision. He spent his days mentoring the younger generation, passing on his knowledge of reading the wind, navigating by the stars, and understanding the hydraulic secrets of the mountain. He knew that he wouldn't live forever, and for the settlement to survive, his skills had to become common knowledge. He was no longer the architect of shadows out of necessity. He was becoming the elder of a tribe, a man who had successfully transitioned from fighting against a system to building a world that rendered that system irrelevant. As the first autumn in the mountains began to turn the ridges into a sea of gold and crimson, Jonas took a young boy named Thomas to the highest peak overlooking the valley. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the wind move through the trees below like a physical breath. Jonas showed the boy how to smell the coming snow on the air and how to listen for the subtle shift in the forest's rhythm that signaled the approach of large animals or distant travelers. "The world is always talking to you, Thomas," Jonas said, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to match the stones they sat upon. "Most people spend their lives trying to scream over it, but the ones who stay free are the ones who learn to listen. Freedom isn't just about being away from the lash, it's about being in a place where your mind has enough room to grow roots." Thomas nodded, his small hand resting on the rough granite, his eyes clear and unafraid. The story of Jonas Hol is not just a tale of a man who escaped a plantation. It is a chronicle of the human spirit's refusal to be contained by the boundaries of others. He had outthought 100 hunters, survived an elemental fire, and led a community through a jagged wilderness to find a home where the only master was the change of the seasons. As the sun set over the final ridge, casting long, purple shadows across the thriving valley, Jonas felt a profound sense of completion. He had spent 10 years watching and 10 years waiting, and now he was spending the rest of his life watching something beautiful grow. The swamp might still whisper his name, and the plantation ledgers might still list him as a loss, but in the heart of the mountains, Jonas Hol was finally exactly what he was always meant to be, a man who was whole.